Our gospel reading this morning comes from Luke. All four of the gospel writers tell the Easter story in slightly different ways. For Luke, one of the major things that he wants to emphasize is the fact that when Jesus was buried, the women, like Mary Magdalene, were there. They saw him placed in the tomb. They saw the stone rolled in front of it. It is those same women who show up on Sunday morning. Hear these words. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, the women came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly, two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how Jesus told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again?" Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 apostles and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them to be an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Please pray with me. Might words spoken and words heard and the spaces in between bring us hope. Amen. This past week, the world has been riveted by the news coming out of Paris about Notre Dame. As the fire swept through the 800-year-old structure, as the spire collapsed, as the timbers went up in flames, thousands gathered on the surrounding streets, many in tears, many offering up prayers, many in that very secular land singing hymns. Notre Dame was built on an island in the Seine. There is a marker in the cathedral which states point zero. It is at the exact center of the city, and in many ways at the exact center of France. Indeed, though France is a largely secular nation these days, the fire struck at the very heart of the French people. It was King Louis VII, back in 1163, who ordered the building of the cathedral. It was to be constructed in honor of the Virgin Mary, Our Lady, Notre Dame. It took close to 200 years to complete. Those who started work on it never saw it finished. Various parts of the cathedral were dedicated when they were finished. In 1231, the cathedral's most precious relic, the crown of thorns purported to be worn by Jesus at his crucifixion, was placed in the structure. But it wasn't until 1345 that the magnificent building was finally completed. Over the years, Notre Dame has witnessed much history, serving as a place where kings were crowned. Even Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, the patron saint of France, passed through its doors. But with the advent of the French Revolution in the late 18th century, the cathedral met disaster. Some 28 statues of biblical saints were beheaded by those protesting the monarchy. Off with their heads. They mistook the robed figures of prophets and apostles for long dead French kings. Other statues, both inside and outside, were destroyed. The goddess of liberty took the place of the central statue of the Virgin Mary. And the building in time was turned into a warehouse. At the turn of the 19th century, however, Napoleon Bonaparte, not known for his religiosity or his deep spiritual life, Napoleon Bonaparte had come to power, and he returned the revered cathedral back to the control of the Roman Catholic Church. What they got back, however, was a far cry from what it had once been. Indeed, the interior of the cathedral lay in ruin. But then came the publication of Victor Hugo's novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, with its story of Quasimodo, the bell ringer, and its beautiful descriptions, 2 full chapters of descriptions of the cathedral itself. And with its publication came renewed interest in the French icon. In 1844, King Louis Philippe ordered its restoration, and some 25 years later, the cathedral was returned to its former glory. So it is that the blaze that brought down the spire and ruined the nave of the cathedral is not the first time the grand structure has faced the prospect of destruction. But the good news is that in response to this most recent tragedy, the people of France, indeed, the people of the world, have offered up funding that will make it possible for the 800-year-old cathedral to rise from the ashes and once again stand as a reminder of faith and a sign of hope right there in the very center of one of the most secular cities in the world. How appropriate, a resurrection story for Easter. For while the cathedral is clearly a cultural icon and a symbol of French pride, it is also, and indeed primarily, a place of worship, a place of faith. Through the centuries, masses have been offered daily in that cathedral. Right up to the time of the fire, masses were offered every single day and 5 times on Sundays. And while the building, its statuary, its spire can be ransacked, burned, even beheaded, the faith that Notre Dame represents cannot be destroyed. As an official of the Church of England noted this week, the spirit of what it means to be a cathedral can and does survive such catastrophes. Other cathedrals have faced such disasters, but all have been rebuilt, sometimes taking on new forms to stand as reminders of eternity and resurrection, which are the foundation of the Christian faith: eternity and resurrection. The foundation, of course, was laid 2,000 years ago, laid in the telling of an old story, a story far older than Notre Dame, laid in a story we tell over and over and over again about a Jewish rabbi named Jesus, who came from a small, unimportant town called Nazareth, and how he spent 3 years traveling around the countryside of ancient Palestine, teaching about the love of God, how he healed the sick and comforted the grieving, how he extended a welcoming hand to the outcasts and shared meals with tax collectors and even prostitutes, how he dared to visit the homes of those who were most outcast, the lepers. And over time, more and more people began to think this Jesus might be the anointed one of God, the longed-for Messiah, the one who would set them free. But there were those who did not want the balance of power disrupted, those who clung tightly to their positions of authority. They couldn't abide what they perceived to be a threat to their power. And so they would use any means necessary to make sure that upstarts like the Nazarene were stopped dead and cold in their tracks. So they had him arrested, used trumped-up charges to bring him down, and then made sure that he would be kept quiet by putting him to death, hanging him up on a cross right beside a major thoroughfare, a cross so that all could see who was really in charge and not just a pretender to the throne. For a time, for a short time, it derailed his movement. For a short time, it drove his fearful followers into hiding. But then some of the women visited the borrowed tomb where his body had been placed. Brave women. Make no mistake about it. They were brave, courageous women who were willing to risk being identified as a follower of this criminal just executed 2 days earlier. Brave women who, out of love, went to provide him with the honors due the dead. Women who worried about how, when they got to the tomb, they would be able to get into it, for a large round stone had been rolled in front of the opening to keep out beasts and bandits. But then when they got there, the stone had been rolled back, and 2 men, or were they angels, suddenly appeared beside them. "He's not here," they said. "He has risen." It was more than they had hoped for. And they fled from that place to tell the others, the men who had been closest to him, those we've come to call apostles. But they were just women. According to the law, not even eligible to be witnesses at a trial. How could they be trusted? "You women are subject to flights of fancy," they said, "controlled by your emotions, unable to see clearly through your tears." And so they are discounted. "Idle tales," the men all say, some even chuckling at the ludicrous nature of their story. "Fuel for the rumor mills," says one of them. "Fodder for gossip," says another. And so they are dismissed. Go home, make dinner, clean the house, watch the children, stop spreading idle tales. Some things never change, do they? But one of the men was willing to go see for himself. And when he got there, he discovered they were telling the truth. And in time, he would find the courage that they already had and would stand up right in the middle of Jerusalem and proclaim the news. This man of Nazareth who was crucified, says Peter, he has been raised from the dead, and he lives on in some mysterious way. He lives on. And so the story spread and spread and spread, a story that in time would lead to the building of Notre Dame, and so much more. Now, you may be a skeptic and come here this morning with grave doubts about the story, here just because your mother or father said you ought to come. But no matter what you think actually happened on that first Easter so long ago, it is hard to deny that the followers of Jesus, the same men who had been so afraid they were in hiding, the same women who had been awash in grief, these men and women were transformed. And though one might be tempted to write off their stories of experiencing Jesus in a new way as idle tales and gossip, to dismiss it as fake news, it really is good news. And a more honest response is to acknowledge the fact that new life rose up out of the ashes of defeat. For ever since, the hope kindled on that first Easter has empowered the church. The church that against all odds exists to this very morning. We've seen that hope this week in France, where the ashes of a cathedral dedicated to the Virgin Mary already hold the promises of new life. And we've also seen it right here in our very own nation. We've seen it at another church named for the mother of Jesus, St. Mary Missionary Baptist Church in Opelousas, Louisiana, which I'm willing to bet most of you have never even heard of. Close to a month ago now, St. Mary's was also ablaze, as its brick structure in rural Louisiana was gutted by fire. It was the first of 3 churches in tiny St. Landry Parish that was burned. 3 black churches where former slaves and their descendants have gathered to tell the old story for over 140 years now, seemingly destroyed not just by fire, but by hate. Churches without the resources or the notoriety of Notre Dame. Churches unknown by most of the world to this day, and certainly unknown by most until disaster struck. Yet those congregations are worshiping on this morning in borrowed places like a borrowed tomb. They are worshiping in a storefront, in a shared sanctuary, and they are buoyed up by the same hope that burst forth from that tomb in ancient Jerusalem. Virgie Spree has been attending one of those churches for all 70 years of her life, for twice as long as this building has even existed. Her granddaughters shared her pew before it was burned. That's been my church all my life, she says. I was a lost soul, and going there has kept me straight. She is grief-stricken, but she has hope. I know the answer is now in God's hands, she says. Joe Dario is a parishioner at St. Mary's. It's been very hard, he says, but there is strong faith that has come out of this. And maybe it's best summed up by the pastor of one of the congregations, who, surveying the damage to their building, to the charred bricks that remained, shook his head and looked up with determination. This is awful, he said, but the church is alive. The church is alive. And all three congregations, these tiny, rural, minority congregations, intend to rebuild, and they will. They, too, will rise up from the ashes. That kind of conviction, sisters and brothers, doesn't grow out of idle tales and gossip. It doesn't grow out of fake news, but good news. It is rooted in truth. It is rooted in the powerful truth that 2,000 years ago, men and women were transformed by their strong conviction that somehow, some way, the one they called teacher was still with them, still present, and that somehow had been made possible by the love of God, love that never ends, a love that conquers all. For Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed.